Hi, this is Pastor Barry with a supplement to the supplement video for Discipleship Essentials, Chapter 12 on justification. In the original video, I raised a subject, uh, the new perspective on Paul, and I wanted to kind of expand that here for those of you who might be interested. The new perspective on Paul really started as a historical correction. It had to do with how scholars understand Jewish religion of the first century. And so, the way that you might ask the question is, what was Jewish religion in the first century really about? Uh, for years and years, people understood Jewish religion as a works-based religion where people tried to earn the favor of God. And so then when they read Romans, they said, Paul is arguing against that. And he is saying that there is no way to earn the favor of God by obeying his law, because all of us fall short of that. None of us are able to keep the law. And so we have to be saved by God uh, through his grace in giving Jesus and receiving the forgiveness of sins that way. The New Perspective people have brought a corrective to that. They've tried to point out that Jewish religion was never intended to be a works-based religion, and their argument would be that Jewish religion of the first century still isn't primarily a works-based religion of trying to earn favor with God through our works. Instead, they would say that first century Judaism was uh, understood by the Jews as a grace-based thing for the most part, that God had chosen them through no doing of their own, and that they saw their works as a response to God's grace, not to earn anything with God, but as part of their faithfulness in their relationship to God. So every relationship has requirements, if you will, and it's not that those requirements earn anything, they're just part of what it means to be in the relationship. I've been married to my wife for 25 years this November, and part of what it means for me to be in relationship with her is to treat her a certain way, to make time for our date nights and to run by her the way that we're spending money and those kinds of things. Those things aren't supposed to earn me favor with her. They're just part of what it means to have a relationship with her. And so the New Perspective people have said, for various reasons, that this is actually the truth about first century Judaism. So Romans, even though it does talk about salvation being given as a gift of God's grace, is not so much primarily focused on that as it is on other issues. And so what starts off as a historical question ends up affecting the way that we read the Bible. Remember that when we read the Bible, we're not just looking at these words as if they were just written to us. I mean, they are written for us, but we also understand that they were written at a particular time to a particular group of people. And it helps us to understand who were those people and what were their problems and why is this person writing to them. And as we understand that, it becomes easier for us to faithfully appropriate the message of New Testament and Old Testament books to our own lives. I think we apply them better when we understand the background historically and culturally uh, better. So there are all kinds of questions that this raises about a passage like Romans 3, which many of you are studying this week. One is a question: what is Paul arguing for, and what is he arguing against? Is he arguing against works-based religion and for a salvation that is by faith alone as a gift of God? Or is that one of the things that he talks about, but he's actually focused on something entirely different, arguing against the church breaking apart along ethnic and racial lines and arguing for their essential oneness as the people of God, Jew and Gentile. So they're different culturally, but still they are the one people of God. So is that what he's arguing for? And actually using the salvation as a gift of God and our inability to earn favor with God as an argument for why we all need to stay together. That would be the new perspective understanding of Romans. Basically, to give you a little background here, they point out that in the Roman church, there were both Jews and Gentiles. And then in about the middle of the first century, there was this terrible persecution of the Jews, and they all got thrown out of Rome. And at that point, the Roman church became almost exclusively Gentile, mostly Gentile members, mostly Gentile leaders, because the Jews had all been forced out of Rome. And it kind of grew that way and developed its own sort of character as a church ethnically. And then later, when the persecution cooled off, the Jews came back to Rome. But when they came back to join the church was very different. There were new Gentiles that had come to Christ since they had left. The church was now being run by Gentiles and had a predominantly Gentile character. And so then the question becomes, what does it look like for these guys to be faithful to God? As I said, in every relationship, there are requirements. And if part of what it means to be a person of God is to be circumcised and keep these dietary restrictions and to make sure you keep the Sabbath, then they would want these new Christians to do that so that they could be part of the relationship. And it shouldn't be a surprise that there was some pushback on the other side from the Gentiles. But you had this strange situation where both sides could kind of feel superior to the other. The Jews, because they were the chosen people, given the stone tablets written on by the hand of God himself. And they were the chosen people. And so they had a relationship with God before anybody else, before any of the other nations. But the Gentiles could also feel superior. They could look at the Jews and feel like, the Jews perhaps had not been entirely faithful and that God had kind of moved on to bring in the Gentiles. And so, the Jews are okay and everything, but they're not, their time is past and this is our time. And Paul then in Romans would be arguing for them not to think of themselves as superior to one another, to not divide over these ethnic things, but to find their essential oneness in the fact that they are all sinners, that they are all saved by grace, and that they need to be members of one another, to prefer one another in honor, as it says in many other places in Paul's letters. There's another question that we need to ask as we think about these two ways of reading Romans. This whole idea of what makes more sense of Romans as a letter. Sometimes Romans is read not as a letter at all, but as kind of a summation of Paul's theology. Again, the classic Reformation reading of this is kind of that Paul is at the end of his life. He's trying to sum up his gospel for the Romans so that they can understand what it is that he teaches, what it is that he's about. They end up having a little problem, actually more than a little problem, with Romans 9 through 11 because those chapters don't fit the notion that what Romans is really about is salvation as a gift of God's grace through faith. And if you read Romans 9 through 11, you'll realize it's a really strange thing to have if that's supposed to be the main subject of Romans. I think the New Perspective scholars do a little better on this score because that piece of Romans 9 through 11 that didn't used to fit very well, it was called a digression by many scholars, actually becomes important if we think that the issue in the book of Romans is this division between Jew and Gentile and what is going to happen to the Jews if God has welcomed in the Gentiles and they don't have to act Jewish. So I think the New Perspective in some ways makes more sense of Romans as a letter to a particular people in a particular context. It also makes more sense of the letter as a whole. If we understand everything from Romans 1 to Romans 16, how does all that fit together to make one argument? And if you've never read Romans all the way through, I highly recommend it. Something I want to get to a little later is the question of what are the implications for what it means to be a Christian and for what it means to be the church. I said earlier, the Reformation tended to think of salvation in individualistic terms. I'm a sinner as one who has broken God's law. I am saved by the work of Jesus on the cross and the gift of God's forgiveness. And what it means to be saved is for me to have a relationship with God and to go to heaven someday. Just in brief, if sin is really rebellion against the relationship with God, a breaking away from God's kingship, if you will, and if salvation is the restoration of that kingship, not just over me, but over all of creation, then part of what it means for me to be a Christian then is to be a part of this bigger mission of God in the world, of seeing the redemption of creation. So that salvation becomes about more than just myself, or more even than just the church, but about everything coming under the kingly rule of Jesus. There are some key concepts that the two sides interpret differently. I'm going to run through these really quickly. The New Perspective people understand works of the law not as works that you do to earn or merit salvation, but rather as ways of identifying with the Jews, ways of identifying yourself as a person of God. Usually the three things I named earlier, the dietary restrictions, circumcision, and the keeping of the Sabbath. Those things specifically end up being works of the law. There is some disputing over what the term righteousness means. I said in the first video, righteousness has been understood as the moral character of God, or the moral purity of God that he imputes to us, that he accounts to us when we put our faith in Jesus. A New Perspective people tend to understand the righteousness of God as God's faithfulness to the covenant. N.T. Wright ends up translating it in his version of Romans chapter 3 as the covenant justice of God. That idea of God's faithfulness to the covenant comes from the Old Testament, where if you look up the word righteousness, just look in a commentary or type it into a search engine, you'll find that righteousness is often associated with God's keeping his promises to his people. And then Romans would be about how God does that in the person of Jesus. There are differences in how they understand the word faith. It could be translated faith. It could be translated faithfulness. It's the same Greek word, pistis. And there's also a difference in whether the issue that Paul is about is faith in Jesus or the faithfulness of Jesus. That's more of a question of emphasis. I think both sides think it's important that we put our trust in Jesus, and that we can only do that because of what Jesus has done. So that one, I think, is more of a question of emphasis than anything else. Then there's some question of what it means to be justified. Are we justified now, or are we going to be justified someday? I really actually don't have time to spend a lot of time on that, just to let you know that there is some question about that. Now, before I go on to the implications, let me say what is not at stake here is whether or not we can earn our salvation. We cannot. And the New Perspective people, at least the ones that I read, New Perspective is pretty big. There's always people that believe all kinds of crazy things. But the New Perspective people, by and large, do not believe in salvation by works. And they shouldn't. They would agree that salvation is a gift of God's grace. But they are saying that there's a little bit different emphasis, especially in a book like Romans. So what does this mean? Like, what's the difference? I've just given you a bunch of what could sound like gobbledygook to some of you. How much does it matter? Well, it depends, but I think it could be fairly significant because it changes the way that we think about some very important ideas. Take sin, for instance. Sin becomes not just breaking God's law, as if the real issue here is, can I keep the rules? No, I can't, and so God is really angry about that. Sin is actually rebellion against relationship with God. It's rebellion against God's kingship and kind of going my own way. And so, yeah, it's a very different way of thinking about sin. It's also a different way of thinking about salvation. So, in the first way, if my problem is that I've broken the law, then the solution is that Jesus paid the price for my law breaking so that I could be forgiven. And that's how salvation gets purchased. That's how I can be in a relationship with God for eternity. And it really is my being in a relationship with God. It tends to be thought of more individually. But if sin is actually rebellion against God's kingship, then salvation is about the restoration of God's kingship and about the restoration of the relationship that I have with him as king, as well as the restoration of his kingship in all of creation. The first way of understanding the gospel ends up being that Jesus gave his life on the cross for me so that I could be saved and have a relationship with God, to have a secure eternity. But the gospel, in the new perspective, ends up being that the king has come back to rule and is establishing his kingly rule over us and over all of creation. And that changes the way that we think about the mission of the church. If the gospel is that Jesus died for people's sins so that they could have a relationship with him and have a secure eternity, that's a message we need to get to as many people as possible. But if that's only part of the mission of the church, if the mission of the church is actually about being a part of the restoration of the kingship of God over all creation, then yes, we need to be out there preaching about the death of Jesus on the cross, about the forgiveness of sins, about a relationship with God. But we're also a part of this much bigger thing that God is doing in the world as he establishes his kingship over every area of life, not just over people, but over the ways that, or not just over individual people, but over the ways they relate to one another, over creation, the environment, and a host of other things. Well, I'm already over here on time. Let me just wind up by saying I have posted one resource for you online. It is Romans chapter 3, verses 21 through 31 from the N.T. Wright translation of the New Testament, entitled The Kingdom New Testament. So just recently published. I just got that little section out so that you can have a look at how he is interpreting Romans. There's all kinds of other books and resources that I could get to you if you're really that interested. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of some of these differences. It may seem a little abstract for some of you, but trust me on this. It has huge implications for what it means for us to be disciples of Jesus, for what it means for us to be proclaimers of the gospel, and for what it means for us as the church of God in the world sent to represent him. So definitely worth thinking about, definitely worth praying about, and searching the scriptures to decide what we believe the Bible is teaching us, what God is teaching us about what really matters. So if you've gotten this far, a double blessing to you for your attention, and God bless you as you continue to walk this walk with him.